Welcome to a semi-official part of the NYU Game Center's Fall 2023 lecture series. It's my great pleasure as the chair of the department to introduce this latest talk, which will be a discussion between the two gentlemen to my left. But I'd like to say a couple words of introduction. There used to be, a long time ago, these services that would get things like from restaurants and take them to your house, right? Or other types of goods. One of them was called Cosmo.com. And I visited the offices of Cosmo.com, I think in 2003, 2004, somewhere around 2004, I think. After having left my job working for Lego and changed my name and a bunch of other stuff. And I went to interview, and the person who interviewed me was the art director of Cosmo.com, a man named Frank Lantz at the time. It was very nice because he just sort of let me do like a practice interview because I hadn't interviewed anywhere for a long time. And I was like, oh, cool, tell me about Cosmo.com. And it was like, okay, I heard about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay. Definitely don't want to work at Cosmo.com. But, and I think Frank was like, yeah, I'm not going to hire Naomi. And we'd already worked together on games and stuff. But little did I know that a number of years later, maybe like a little more than a decade later, I'd once again be interviewing, talking to Frank and a bunch of other people, maybe from this room, for a job here at the NYU Game Center. Because Frank is the founding chair and director of this program. He's been away for a little while now. We're very glad to have him back. And I think this book which you're about to hear about is a really dense, rich encapsulation of so much of the philosophy that informed the foundation of this department. A couple years ago, when I took over from Frank, we tried to have a conversation about Frank is handing over the NYU Game Center to Naomi. We'll have our ideas in conversation with each other. And I had to be like, oh my God, how are my ideas different? I don't know. I came up with stuff really fast, and hopefully I convinced a bunch of you, including those of you who then applied to come to this program. But really, there are a few people who have been more influential on my own thought about games. And I used to really love to go to Frank's talks every year at the Game Developers Conference, which I always sort of felt like was a little bit like going to game church and kind of thinking, having a solemn, worshipful moment to think about what makes play special. All right, so I think that pretty much says everything I have to say in praise of this topic. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our professor, Charles Pratt, who is going to serve as the interlocutor and discussant with Frank tonight about his new book, The Beauty of Games. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Naomi. I actually want to do a little bit of my own introduction, which is that I think, like a lot of people in this room, we would not be here without Frank to a large extent. But for me especially, I would not. I know for certain I would not be here without Frank. I came to New York in the mid-aughts to go to ITP, the grad school ITP. That's where I met Frank and I was one of the two people who was interested in games at that point. Do you remember?
It was a handful of people.
It was a handful of people, and it felt like two sometimes. And I took Frank's classes. You had 3 classes at that time. I took what is now Intro to Game Design. If you take an Intro to Game Design, I took a very early version of that I think you and Eric had designed.
Yep.
I took Big Games. Mm-hmm. And you had what is kind of now was like the prototype for Intro to Game Studies, the class that I teach now, which was just kind of a seminar class where we got together and read. And I was lucky enough to make friends with Frank and have him as a mentor as I began my career. And I've always been extraordinarily grateful for the doors he opened for me and the ways that he helped me in my early career. And I definitely would not be here sitting right now talking about this book. Were it not for him. So I thank you, Frank. I really appreciate, and I always will.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. Unless you want to introduce yourself? Now 2 people have introduced you.
No, I think let's just go. I mean, I will just say that I'm so happy to be here and see all of you. And this is it's overwhelming because it's been a while. When we slunk away from New York City, it was it was like at the height of lockdown. We were 2 years kind of into COVID, and so we had already gotten used to not seeing people. And so this is overwhelming in a really good way to reconnect and see all these people and be in your presence. And it's amazing. So I'm just really happy to be here.
Awesome. I want to start out by getting a little bit of context for the book before we dive into the ideas.
Sure.
And part of that is, I think, a little bit of your biography. So we got a little bit of a kind of history from Naomi there of her interaction, my interaction with you. Some people here knew one part of your career. Some people know a different part of your career. Can you talk a little bit about, your work as a game designer and then your work, starting the Game Center? A little bit of a biography to give us a sense of who you
Sure.
are and your motivation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I moved to New York to be a painter, I thought I was going to be a painter. That's what I wanted to do. And when I got married to Hillary, she said, "I'll marry you under one condition: you don't make me move to New York." And I said, "Okay." And then like a month later, I said, "Oh, I have an opportunity that I cannot pass up. It's assistant manager at Utrecht Art Supplies." And so she's like, "Okay." Because she knew also when she made that deal, she knew that she was in for it. So we moved to New York, and it was, after a while, pretty clear that I wasn't going to be a painter. But I kind of hung around enough to realize that eventually I needed to do something, and I started. I had some skills with computers, and so I started to do stuff with computers and with computer graphics, and I realized that the thing that I liked about computers was not the graphics, but the computation. And so I was making some very early kind of experimental stuff with software. I had an Amiga and was tinkering with making very, very simple kind of poetry generating machines and picture generating machines, and getting more and more involved in kind of that stuff. And I got a job doing computer graphics at a place called RGA, and then at the right around that time, RGA, which is this venerable New York institution of a big design studio that does film titles and computer graphics and special effects for television and film. And I was kind of like working on the print side of things and getting into Photoshop and things like that. But we started doing software design. So this is the early stages of kind of defining what it meant to be a software designer, this idea of interaction design as a skill set. So I kind of helped start that at RGA along with my friend Brian and Karen and other colleagues. And we decided, we're going to start making games too. Because like if you're going to design software, like that means games in a sense. Like games are the art form of software, right? So if you have if you're making software whose goal is to accomplish some outcome, some specific outcome, then you're in the realm of interaction design. But if you're designing software for its own sake, in order to interact with it for its own sake, and what's entertaining and interesting and meaningful and beautiful about software on its own, that's really games. And so we started to get more and more kind of like involved in games there. Along came a guy named Eric Zimmerman, who we hired, and who also kind of shared my interest in this kind of in-between space between fine art and pop culture that video games seem to be poised to explode to fill, right? This was, in many ways, more exciting, more promising than something like painting ever could be. Like, painting is still like, look, painting is great. If there are any painters here, I love you, and you're doing great. Keep going. But to me, at the time, it just seemed like, oh no, this was everything I wanted from painting, right? Because it was about ideas, and it was about engaging with the weirdest and kind of most interesting aspects of culture, and making work that responded to it. And so I really, I kind of fell into doing games.
And what year are we talking about here? When around is this?
Oh God, 1990s. I'm thinking
1990s?
is
Yeah.
the 90s.
That makes sense.
When was the Summer of Love in England? It was the rave stuff. That was like it was right around then.
Yeah.
And so like and specifically. Wipeout. I don't know if you guys remember this game. This video game, Wipeout, had a huge impact on us. And had a huge impact on me because Wipeout was, for me, one of the first video games that felt like an album. Like video games were then and still are, to a certain degree, kind of stuck a little bit in this kind of kids culture zone where it's like, are they for babies? Are they for children? Are they for grown children? Like, are they for pre-adolescent boys? You know, like, so they kind of had this. Then Wipeout felt like, oh, here's an example of video games that is full on pop culture in a kind of sophisticated mode that was something you could have totally imagined doing and making. It was like, this is the kind of stuff I want to make. And yeah, so it would have been 90s, early mid 90s. Yeah.
And then you're working with Eric. Rules of Play happens in the early 2000s, right? 2003, 2004.
Yeah. So
and that's when you all do the game design workshop, right? At GDC, you start.
Yeah. Well, Eric comes from a family of academics. And so as we started figuring out what does it mean to do game design, especially what does it mean to do game design in this mode where we were pretentious, wannabe intellectuals in New York City who wanted to make games that were like the Bauhaus or something. You know what I mean? Like that was, we felt like, oh yeah, no, this, like we want to make important, interesting, groundbreaking, avant-garde culture, and video games are clearly what you should do if you want to do that. And he was like, we were just kind of figuring out what that meant. And he was like, let's go teach a class at NYU. And I was like, how would we don't even know what we're doing. Shouldn't you know what you're doing before you teach a class? And he was like, no, it's going to be fine. Let's just go. So we went to Red Burns, who ran ITP at the time. And Red Burns was kind of famously disinterested in games. Because at the time, if you were an ITP type person who was interested in creativity and software and computation and art, then games and pornography and gambling were like the things that like you weren't interested in. Like, and so, but to her credit, she said, yeah, okay. She's like, we want to teach a class in games. She's like, sounds good. Let's teach a class in games. So that's what got us started. And we went to Bop's library and pulled out all the books on games we could find. And like, here was like Bernard Sutton Smith and, here's Johann Huizinga and here's, and then, Mackenzie Wark and like all these other kinds of scholarly things. We were trying to put together cobble together our own kind of framework for this for teaching and thinking about games, and then so that was the origin kind of those early classes, and then Rules of Play came out of that.
Interesting. And how did you end up in charge of the Game Center?
Well, we had been teaching at ITP for a while, and we were kind of team teaching, and sometimes he would do a semester, I would do a semester, sometimes we'd co-teach. And eventually, NYU got a very generous donation from an anonymous donor who wanted to do something with games. And I think the people at NYU were like, great, we're going to do something about computers and interactive media and digital culture. And this donor was like, no, I want it to be about games. And so the folks at NYU were like, oh, well, who do we know that's doing something about games? And so at the time I had just started Area Code, and I was very busy, kind of running this little studio. and I didn't think I would have time to do it, but I said, I'll do it if I can kind of do it as like an interim thing, interim director. And so that's how it started with, they kind of just tapped me to come in, help set things up. And I said, who do I know?
Who do I know? Who likes games? Wait a minute.
So I reached out to you, and you were like one of the first people. Obviously, Eric was there. Jesper Juhl was around, and Roseanne Limoncelli helped. Who kind of like helped me navigate, you know, what it meant, because I had
always important that you knew what you were doing.
Well,
because you were in charge.
I mean, if you're an adjunct, I was just an adjunct professor for years, for like 10 years, you know, and that was the level at which I felt comfortable. And you're kind of vaguely aware that there's this whole game being played above you, but you just don't care about it, right? So then you get kind of like elevated into that, and now you have to care about it. And the truth is that, like, if you don't enjoy that a little bit, then you're just dead in the water. You have to have a little bit of taste for the Machiavellian machinations of what it means to operate within that realm, and to do a little bit of empire building. And so I was like, yeah, let's go for it. Let's build not just a game design program, but let's build the best game design program on the planet. You know, like, why not? Like, it's like, and this was a big part of our thinking, I think, at the time, and my thinking always is like, this is New York City, right? This is one of the cultural capitals of the world. This is the place that the weirdest, smartest, most ambitious people come to be around each other and to make cool shit, right? And whether that's film or theater, fashion, photography, dance, literature, painting, whatever it is, you know, you come to New York, it's like a beacon for a certain type of person. And New York should have a game design scene and a game design program that kind of reflects that attitude. That isn't just like, you know, hi, we're on the East Coast. We're not really part of the main game, game industry. And instead kind of embraces the fact that we are a little bit outside of those standard game industry orbits. In the same way that NYU Film, a generation earlier had done that for movies. They embraced the fact that they weren't in Hollywood, and helped kind of create the American New Wave in film. And so that's what we wanted to do here. And I think to a large degree have succeeded. I'm extremely proud of the work that has been done here, and the community that we've like gathered around this project.
From the very beginning, you mentioned Jesper Juhl. From the very beginning, when you started the program, I remember you having a very strong feeling that there should be, like, this can't just be a design program. It needs some kind of, we want to not just produce people who know how to make games, but people who know how to think and talk about games. We want to have, we need some kind of intellectual training in this program. And I remember it being very important to you. That's part of the reason that Jesper was there, as I think Eric and Jesper were the first two hires, right? First two full-time faculty hires other than yourself. So, could you talk a little bit about why that was important to you? Because I think,
it's because we wanted to make the Bauhaus. It's because it wasn't like we wanted to find that in between place that isn't just people who are good at talking the talk. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not what we wanted. Like, it wasn't just, people can pontificate about games and say smart sounding things. But we didn't want the other end of that spectrum, which is just to be a kind of purely pragmatic kind of training ground for, if you want a job in the game industry, you can learn how to make games technically. Instead, we wanted those two things to be, to find the overlap. That there is we wanted to create a context in which people were making games and learning how to make games, but for the purpose of doing really groundbreaking work, to do innovative work, not just to not to be an appendage to the industry, but to be complementary to the industry. And so that really did mean like thinking about all of these issues, like all of the stuff that's in this book, right? Is these larger questions like, well, why are you making a game? Like, what is it? What do you like about them? What's good about them? What drew you to this as a project? And how to, but then also like where to put the curly brackets, you know, and where to put the semicolon, and like how to make a piece of software go. And so and to us, it was always kind of, maybe more for me than for Eric. I think Eric has had a bit more of a tension between programming and game design, but I see them as very, very much the same thing in a way. I mean, some people take to programming and some people don't, but it was always this idea that building the engineering part of game design, whether you're making a board game or a video game, there's a lot of engineering in it, and that is not orthogonal to the creative part. That is they're synchronous. They solving those engineering problems and solving the creative problems simultaneously. That's an essential part of what makes game design what it is.
Yeah. Well, this is your first, but maybe not only, contribution to the intellectual, the written intellectual history of games.
Yes.
So why don't we dive into the book a little bit? I am going to do my best job to kind of sketch out what I think the book is saying, and I'm going to, obviously have to shrink some things, and we'll expand on them later. And if I get anything
correct
wrong,
you as you go.
just correct me. Yes,
Okay.
please. That's what I want. I've only read this book twice, so I probably got some things wrong. So I think of this book as really being divided kind of into two halves. The first half is the real main argument, which is games as an argument for games as an aesthetic form, but producing and supporting a particular kind of aesthetic experience. The phrase you use to describe it is thought visible to itself, which is really beautiful, poetic. And something that I popped into my head was the much more vulgar metacognitive optimization. This kind of idea
Same thing. Yeah.
This idea of kind of you have to think about your thinking, and that games not only offer an opportunity for that, but sometimes require that. Now, there's a little bit more in there. Now, then there's the second half of the book where I think you take that argument and say, okay, how do we use this to think about the outside of games, the culture at large, both how games are interacting with these currents that have been going maybe since, the mid-20th century. And then the final chapter kind of like, okay, how do we look into the future? So I think of those as kind of two separate parts, and I think maybe I'll ask my questions kind of divided between the two. Okay. But is there anything you want to correct me about?
No, I think that's a good summary. I mean, I will say that what I want for this book is I want everyone in this room to like it. I want people who are already like involved in games to like it. But if you're in this room that you probably heard a lot of me say a lot of these things already. It's not going to be any big shocks, that. But I also want to reach a broader audience because it does seem to me that games have struggled to participate in ongoing public cultural conversations. There is a way in which I think film and literature and other cultural forms kind of feel like they're part of this conversation that we have collectively about who we are and what we're doing. And it seems like games have struggled to participate, even though, as an industry, they're bigger than movies and music combined. They don't feel like they have that presence in our ongoing conversations about what's going on and what matters, and I feel like they could. I think one of the reasons that they don't is it's partly because of how awesome they are. You know what I mean? Like they're so, like any individual game, any successful game, any good game is so big and absorbing and complex that it creates its own world, a world that you can disappear into and kind of never emerge, right? It feels like they will absorb all of our attention and all of our intellectual work, and you can just like pour that into them, and it doesn't come back. But I feel like it does come back. I feel like that's a bit of an illusion. I think even though they really are difficult to talk about and difficult to put into context and understand, partly because they are capacious in this way, I do think that you can make that round trip. And so this book was partly my attempt to kind of make that round trip and to talk about it. Like, what does it mean to kind of like have a life with a lot of games in it, to like understand and love games and make them and play them and have them be a big part of your life, and then to kind of have that resonate with the rest of your life and with other people's lives, and to have it be part of this conversation about who we are, what we care about, where we're going, and all of those kinds of issues, and so I think that's one of my overarching goals for the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. It does feel like you are. The book is both trying to persuade of certain points, obviously, right? I think there's the person who might be interested in games and be compelled by them, but not have a lot of experience, and maybe feels like they can't really dive in and they need some place to. But there's also the side of it that I do think, even if you're like me, who's familiar with a lot of these ideas, is kind of modeling, right? The way we would have this conversation, the way that, again, like you're saying, you kind of go in, and then when you do come out, what should you bring with you? How do you communicate the thing that you've seen to people who haven't gone, even if they're familiar with other games, right? Aren't necessarily aware of like what you have seen while you were there.
Yeah, and I mean, and you see this in mainstream media. You see it in the way that the New York Times, for example, struggles to like talk about games. I mean, look at this huge industry, and it's full of clearly something, right? It's full of creativity, it's full of money, it's full of activity, and yet, what do we say about it? Like, how do we, and that's partly reflective of the fact that it is genuinely confusing. Like, it's really confusing. Games are confusing on purpose in a way. And so you look at games, if you're not already part of the scene, and you're like, what are they? Are they hedonic appliances? You know what I mean? Are they devices that we plug in order to like have this fantasy of being a different person, and now I'm a fireman, and and then they're like, so do we just put them alongside like electric toothbrushes and yogurt makers? Is that where they belong? Or are they something like movies? Well, let's talk about them like movies. Well, here's a guy with a rope, and he's climbing, and then he shoots a wolf, and now he's climbing again, and now he's wandering around and around in a circle, and he sees a glyph. Is it a puzzle? Oh no, it wasn't a puzzle. It was just art. Okay, so it's like, no, you can't describe them like movies, and you also can't describe them like yogurt makers, right? And so I think people on the outside struggle to like understand what's going on there. I want in the book to kind of show them, to kind of like lead them by the hand and say, no, this is what's going on here, and I know it looks like an explosion in a cartoon factory, but it's not, or it is, but it's a controlled explosion. And the thing we're blowing up, like, it matters, right? And so I think, part of that process was also a commitment to a certain kind of process, a certain kind of mode, which is very much about, I think the answers to all of the questions you might have about games are only answered in direct experience. I don't think you can read and look over the shoulder of someone playing and then read a little something, and then you have to. There is something about being on the inside of a game to like experience what that means, to be inside of a world that was designed to elicit a certain kind of experience, to give you a certain set of challenges and a certain set of affordances, to kind of turn you loose to accomplish something or to experience something, and having that experience and then reflecting on it I think is the main kind of procedural commitment that I wanted to commit to in this thing. So rather than using the tools of literary criticism or film criticism or art criticism, I think we need to develop a new set of tools that are really committed to this kind of experiential process. Yeah.
You use the term, and you almost always use it in a pair, beauty and meaning. It comes up a
Yeah.
lot. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those words mean to you in relation to games.
Beauty and meaning are meant to be a hand-wavy way of referring to what it is that's good about this, like what it is that why we do it. Do you know what I mean? Like, why do you do the crossword puzzle? Why do you play racquetball? Why do you play Fortnite? Why do you play Dungeons and Dragons? It's that there is something that valuable in those things, but they're also meant to be ambiguous in a sense, and not really fully explained or pinned down, because I think they can't be. And that has to do with something that at the beginning of the book, in this first part of the book that you're talking about, where I'm establishing, okay, well, look, you're not going to understand games unless you put them in the context of aesthetic forms. Like they're an aesthetic experience. Well, what does that mean, right? And an aesthetic experience is something outside of ordinary life. It's something that exists alongside ordinary life, but it isn't part of ordinary life. And so when we talk about the values of things in ordinary life, we'll see, well, what's this for? Well, I'm doing it for this purpose. Well, what is this for? Why are you wearing shoes? Like, why did you brush your teeth? Why did you get out of bed in the morning? Like, why did you...
Sometimes I wonder that.
Why did you take the subway? Like, why did you go to school? Why did you get married?
All right, you can stop. It's fine. I understand.
But everything is connected in a chain of explanation that has to do with utility. Like, we assign utility to things. Well, we do things for a reason. And then there are certain things you do, you kind of there's no reason. There's no external reason for why you do them. And so this is the realm of aesthetics, right? And so to say that that's a place that those are experiences that we enter into for beauty and meaning is to kind of, in a light way, say, look, there is something going on here, but I'm not going to let you pin me down as to what it is. I'm not going to, because I can't explain what it is. I can't tell you, I can't give you a receipt for those 50 hours that you spend in Baldur's Gate. That's 100 hours, that's 200 hours that you spend in Baldur's Gate. I'm not going to then at the end give you a receipt that says, congratulations, you now know how to kill a dragon or something. Like, no, you don't know anything more than when you started, in a way. But you had an experience that matters, right? That it does matter. Not because it then cashes out in some other external value that you can point to, where it's like, oh, you're a better cocktail party guest, right? You can talk, about Baldur's Gate, or that you understand how to solve problems in a new way. It's like, yes, all of this might be true, but it's almost beside the point. What really matters is that while you were there, something was happening, right? There was a part of you that was in a different place, doing a different thing, experiencing something that other people also, they made for that reason. They made in order for you to be there, to want it in a certain way, to desire it, but also to appreciate it in a certain way. So these are the qualities. Now, this is what games share with every other kind of creative forms. This is not something that sets games apart from music and film and painting. This is what joins them. Like, all of these things have this in common. And in games, the thing that makes it especially challenging is that there's a paradox, which is that the experience actually is often an experience of utilitarian goal goal accomplishing, right? So you're in Baldur's Gate as a character inside of Baldur's Gate, as a player in that experience. All there is this utility. Is that all there is this web of like doing things for a purpose. I'm doing this, going here to solve this quest, to get this weapon, to improve my ability here, to do, and I'm like understanding the world in order to accomplish things in it and proceed through it and so everything, you're like embedded in the most kind of utility driven this thing I call instrumental reason, right? You're like embedded in instrumental reason. So that's the paradox, right? Is that it's this little gem of utilitarian, instrumental, problem-solving, goal-directed behavior that is itself completely pointless, right? Isn't that absurd? Like, isn't that absurd, right? And that absurdity, I think, is in a weird way kind of at the heart of the book, right? That is the understanding that, like, and that is also part of the explanation of why the New York Times doesn't want to write about it. You know what I mean? Because it is, in a weird way, gutter culture. And I mean that, lovingly. But games are gutter culture. They are the margins of life. Like, they aren't, like, they're the thing that you do instead of doing the dishes. So you like your dishes are piling up and the flies are flying around and there's like, and then you look over and your husband or whoever is like playing a game where he's doing the dishes. You're like, what is happening? You know what I mean? Like pretending to do the dishes. And that weird, there is something crazy about that. It's dark. Don't play with me. Don't play me. Don't play games with me. The reason that, this is not a game. The reason that we have these kinds of phrases is there is something scary about this central paradox that games are places where we pour so much energy and problem solving and no problems get solved, And yet there is this larger problem that can't even be pinned down, that I don't even want to claim that, that is being solved, which is the same problem that is solved by a great poem. It's the problem of heartache. It's a problem of these larger questions. What does it mean to even be a human on the planet? What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be anything, a teacher, a student, a man or a woman, a child or a grown-up, or like any of these roles that we play, any of these things that we do, any of the things that are part of this kind of ordinary life, this outside, this thing that is outside of them, this is what the aesthetic realm is necessary. Like we do all of these things so that we can have beauty and meaning in our lives. You know what I mean? And so, so I think that's the kind of vortex, that's the paradox that's kind of driving the engine. It's a standard paradox engine. It's a standard straight up paradox engine.
Almost every book has one.
So
that brings me, I think, to the particular aesthetic experience that you want to talk about in the book, which I think is, and you center it around a discussion of Go and poker, but this particular experience of examining the way your mind works, right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that means, and how at least one of those games kind of produced it for you, and you kind of communicated that story in the book.
I in the second chapter of the book, there are these two games that are probably the two games that I've spent the most time in my life trying to understand and play and study, and it's Go and it's poker, and I kind of contrast them and I talk about them, and it's like. So first of all, it's one aspect of this book is that I'm claiming that you really can't understand video games unless you put them in this larger context of games in general. So this is everyone who goes to the Game Center kind of like understands this. And we all kind of at least claim to kind of agree that like video games are best understood. They're you can really only truly understand them if you also see them not just as the latest kind of cool gadget, that humans invented in the past 60, 70 years, but really as the latest version of a thing that humans have been doing since before there were humans, since before there was civilization. The games and play are this ancient force, right? And so by picking Go and poker as these important case studies, I'm hopefully kind of like helping people understand that. Like, there's no point in trying to understand Fortnite if you can't also understand tennis and skiing and bowling and bridge and these other things. And so I talk about Go and I talk about poker, both of which had a huge impact on me. Poker especially, because of just the things it does to your head. I mean, poker messes you up, and in a good way if you can harness it. And so I try to talk a little bit about what that feels like, about diving deep into a game like that, letting it do its work on you, letting it rewire you, and then again trying to make that round trip and coming back and saying, okay, now what does that mean? What do I think now? And a big part of those examples was this idea of thought made visible to itself. So in both cases, in both Go and poker, I think they're great examples of something that I find to be an important aspect of pretty much any game experience. Once you start to self-reflect and think about what it is that you're experiencing when you play a game, when you play a game, you're learning and you're observing yourself learning. You get a chance to observe your mind trying to wrap itself around this little toy version of the world. And that's why it's important that it is this gem, right? It's like that it is a work. It is something carved off and made separate from the world. And that what that does is it allows you to experience what it's like to be in the world from a second person perspective. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's like the David Foster Wallace story that he tells about the fish. And there's some young fish, and then there's an old fish, and he swims by, and he says, "Howdy, fellas, how's the water?" And the young fish say, "What's water?" Right. And that's what thinking and doing is like. Like, we are embedded in it. You can't, like, being a human is being a certain kind of pattern, a certain kind of stable pattern that exists far from equilibrium, this dynamic pattern. But that's what you are. You're not a body. You're not a monkey. You're this thing. You're this pattern of perception and prediction and decision making, guided by goals and constrained by your abilities. And you are in the world and you're trying to do things, but you can't see it because it is you. You're inside of it. But when you play a game, you get a chance to see it. That's amazing. Like in the same way that music is about sound and is about listening, and painting is about looking and seeing, games are about thinking and doing. The whole kit and caboodle, the whole being an agent in the world, trying to get stuff done, trying to accomplish stuff, that is made into a little ritual experience, a tiny little ceremony that, and whether it's just doing, Sudoku puzzles, or whether it's playing Red Dead Redemption, in both cases, you are given an opportunity to kind of have almost like an outsider view of what it means to do things in the world. So Sudoku is a good example, because if you start getting into Sudoku, at first you're just like grinding your way through. Well, you're like, okay, bit by bit, you can just apply manually the logical steps that you need to get to the answer. And then after a few days of doing Sudoku, you realize, okay, you're not doing that anymore. That's been wrapped up and chunked into a single cognitive thing that you just now look at it and you see like what now you're solving problems at a higher level. You're still solving problems, but now you're like, okay, let me come up with some new rules of thumb, some new heuristics that operate at this new level. And then you just keep doing that. And you're like, wow, this is like watching my brain work. And then, of course, when you're in a video game, it's an even more intense version of that. If you're playing Super Mario, like part of the escapist fantasy that you're having is just being a coherent being in the world. Like you don't have that experience directly because like the actual experience of being in the world is this weird fragmented nightmare of like I'm here and I'm there and things are happening. I'm being bombarded and I'm like sometimes following scripts and just acting in a way that is automatic. And sometimes I'm consciously deciding what to do. But when you play Super Mario World, you're like a little cartoon version of a human being, right? I'm moving right, and I'm deciding to move right, and I am moving right, and I'm pushing a button to do a thing. The actions, my choices and actions are linked together. My goals and my accomplishments are linked together, and wow, this is great. You know what I mean? So that again is like, it's this opportunity to kind of catch yourself being, right? I'm sure Heidegger has a word for it. I don't know what that might be.
Right.
But can I read something? So this is actually not from my book. I know you're probably supposed to read from your own book at your book launch. But I wanted to read you a real short passage from the book Barbarian Days. Which is by a guy named, I think, William Finnegan, I believe is his name. And it's a book about surfing. But I came across this the other day, and I felt like it was a perfect example of this thing I'm trying to express in the book of thought made visible to itself. So check this out. The close, painstaking study of a tiny patch of coast, every eddy and angle, even down to individual rocks, and in every combination of tide and wind and swell, a longitudinal study through season after season is the basic occupation of surfers at their local break. Getting a spot wired, truly understanding it, can take years. At very complex breaks, it's a lifetime's work, never completed. This is probably not what most people see, glancing seaward, noting surfers in the water. But it's the first order problem that we're out there trying to solve. What are these waves doing exactly? And what are they likely to do next? Before we can ride them, we have to read them, or at least make a credible start on the job. Nearly all of what happens in the water is ineffable. Language is no help. Wave judgment is fundamental, but how to unpack it? You're sitting in a trough between waves, and you can't see past the approaching swell, which will not become a wave you can catch. You start paddling up coast and seaward. Why? If the moment were frozen, you could explain that. By your reckoning, there's a 50-50 chance that the next wave will have a good takeoff spot about 10 yards over and a little farther out from where you are now. This calculation is based on your last 2 or 3 glimpses of the swells outside, each glimpse caught from the crest of a previous swell, the 100+ waves you have seen break in the past hour and a half, your cumulative experience of 300 or 400 sessions at this spot, including 15 or 20 days that were much like this one in terms of swell size, swell direction, wind speed, wind direction, tide, season, and sandbar configuration. The way the water seems to be moving across the bottom, the surface texture and the water color, and beneath these elements, innumerable subcortical perceptions, too subtle and too fleeting to express. That's what I'm trying to get. You know what I mean? Like, and I know what you're saying. You're saying, is surfing a game? And I'm like, yes. What else? What else? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that is the experience. That is the experience of doing Sudoku. It's the experience of playing, Baldur's Gate. That is what I'm getting at.
So this, I think, is a good segue to the second half of the book.
Okay.
And I'm going to attack it this way, which is, that was quite beautiful. And, there is that author, there's Joan Didion on boxing, there's you, there's Seth Killian about fighting games. And, like, occasionally someone comes along and can actually like explain this in some, fashion. So
Yeah.
a language that, might be familiar to Dave Hickey or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Why don't games produce more of those people? Like, why is it that, like, is it just we've never tried it before, we're just getting used to it, we're building a stable of those people? Like, why is it that game culture, unlike all of these other fields that you want to compare games to, literature, film, painting, opera, why isn't it that we're producing more of these people who can communicate this in the way that, again, I don't have to know much about music, or I don't have to know much about painting, and I can read Christgau and be like, I've never even listened to that album, but this is just, I'm getting so much out of just reading.
Yeah.
And I'm getting a view into what someone who really knows and loves this in a way that I will never really know and love it as much as this person does. But they're able to communicate a little bit of that to me. And why is it that it's so rare in games? Even though we're in an era where like everybody is writing on the internet at every single moment of the day, and yet, why not? Why isn't there more of you?
I
in the
mean,
world?
well, there's only I'm trying my best. I'm not really,
You have a Substack. I know you're doing your part.
and 2 grandkids.
Yeah.
I think there is a lot of great writing out there. I think it's harder to find, partly because I think video games, again, they're too awesome. Like, in a weird way, their awesomeness gets in their way. Like, their easy success as pop culture, the success that they've had, has, why bother writing about this stuff when we can just continue making games and playing them? What's in it for me? I think, but there is writing out there. I mean, David Foster Wallace on tennis, Joyce Carol Oates on boxing,
Sorry, not Joan Didion.
David Sudnow on video games.
Yeah, Missile Command.
on Breakout.
Breakout.
And I do think there are I do think there are people out there trying to kind of like figure this out. But I mean, it's genuinely hard, right? And I think it's partly because of the scope of every game. So imagine trying to cultivate a mode of public intellectual writing in which the subject of each piece is a world unto itself, is a hobby unto itself. But that's what someone like the New York Times struggles with. Like, do we, for every game, have to start from scratch and explain? Do you know what I mean? Like, no, what you can do is you commit to a column. If you have a column on bridge, when Omar Sharif was writing a bridge column in the New York Times, like, that's good game criticism, right? Because he's writing about, deep kind of strategic, subtle issues within the game, a particular match that happened that was an important historical thing. I find this, I find something thrilling about watching really good chess analysis on YouTube. So if you watch like Gotham Chess or someone who's really good about analyzing, I'm not really a chess player, but watching someone like that break down a game. Now that is not writing, but it is a form of game criticism in a way. And I think that it's just really hard when a game is a hobby with its own lingo, its own language, its own habits and customs that you don't even begin to understand the first thing of what a Hearthstone card means until you've spent 100 hours in this stupid game. And then you can be like, oh, now I get why it's important. The cards that make tokens are like, yeah, because I can see the way that they function within this larger system. It's just really hard.
I've never surfed, and I can hear you read that passage, and most of us haven't surfed, and we can say like, oh, yeah, like this surf has produced.
But to be fair, Barbarian Days is like, they're not a million books like that. Right. This is a great book about surfing. And
Well, there's something wrong with surfing as well. Why doesn't surfing produce more poets?
Charles, there's more to life than writing.
I'm not sure. Yes, that's probably true. So I want to move on then to, I think that there are two topics before we go to questions that I do want to address about the end of the book, which is one, this dichotomy you discuss of kind of the two cultures, right? Sciences and humanities, that is the center of the third chapter. And then I hope to talk a little bit about meta-rationality, but could you talk a little bit about the two cultures and what that is and introduce that history?
Yeah. So a major theme of the book is that, look, if you want to understand video games, you got to understand these other games. Like, video games make sense within the context of chess and football and tennis and all these other things. Like, if you really want to understand them. Now, then, once you kind of wrap your head around that, as a smart New York Times reader who doesn't understand anything right about video games, like, once you get that point, then I try to hit you with this other point. Like, having said that, games are always already about computation. Even tennis and football, like, chess is obviously about computers, right? You look at chess, if you didn't know anything about, if you were from Mars and you look at a chessboard, you'd be like, what is that, some kind of abacus? Like, it's clearly a bunch of pieces that are just stand-ins for abstract, symbolic, logical icons, and then you're manipulating them according to rules, and you're like working through some kind of problem collectively. That's just a form of computation. That's what you're doing. But there is something also kind of true about that in all games, right? Because they are systems, right? Because they are experiences that are defined by a set of rules, and then the behavior that follows from those rules, right? That's what we're making when we make games. We're making an experience, and we do it with materials and rules, and then exploring the ramifications of those rules as they percolate outwards, right? And create more and more complex, surprising, unpredictable behavior. That's what we're doing. And that is, in a sense, exploring the meaning and the beauty of systems, of rules. And so there is a sense in which these things are deeply connected. And I've always felt this way. At the very beginning of the NYU Game Center, we had an opportunity to decide where it was going to live. And because we had started out at ITP, which was part of Tisch School of the Arts, it was always clear to me that the Game Center belonged in the School of the Arts. But it was a little bit of a surprise to some of the people involved. Oh, you want to stay in Tisch? Yes, absolutely. Because that's the point. The point is that games are about systems, and they have this really important connection to problem solving and engineering and rationality and utility, but they are little works of art. They're little creative, pointless, but like pointful experiences. You know what I mean? Like, and so that was always at the essence, this bringing together these two aspects that are often separated. So the two cultures, famously, this essay written by C.P. Snow in the 50s, and he was bemoaning the culture of the English university, where he said, look, we're starting to have these two separate communities. Half of them have read Samuel Beckett and understand what's going on there in the theater of existential despair. And half of them know what the second law of thermodynamics is and understand how important that is for like a scientific understanding of the world. But they don't go to the same parties. They don't read the same books. They don't teach the same fundamental kinds of historical contexts in their classes. They might as well just be in two separate universes, right? And I think that's I think it's maybe less true in a way today, but I think there is still some great truth there. I think that there is a sense in which there are two kind of broad categories of two stances for looking at the world, one of which is about Shakespeare and Beckett, and literature, and it's about the vibe, it's about the gestalt. It's about a holistic view that incorporates all of your senses and all of your emotions and kind of tries to pull everything together into like this very complex but cloudy vision of how the world works. And it's laden with values and emotions and perception, and so it's very personal and subjective, and we can kind of like work it out between us. But that's one kind of view of the way, one sort of stance that you can be in. You can think of these as like, again, Eric Zimmerman style. You can think of them as being two different martial arts stances, and that's one of them, right? There's another stance which is about breaking things down into smaller pieces and understanding each one of those pieces and how it fits together. It's about doing formal and logical and precise definitions in order to explore how those manifest and what we can learn in a purely objective sense, in a way that it doesn't matter who says it or who does it or who thinks it, it's true. Like, this particle has an up spin, and it's like, maybe that's a bad example because particles can have an heel kind of spin. But you know what I mean? Like this is a fact about the world that is an objective fact. And we can get there by kind of like peeling away a lot of the kind of complexity of the arbitrary qualities of the context to understand it as a concrete fact. And so this is the stance in which we do engineering, in which we solve engineering problems. This is a stance in which we do science. This is the way of looking at the world, which really emphasizes those objective facts that we can discover and then tries to extrapolate from that to larger, but it's very, very difficult process, because as soon as you start adding these things together and get to anywhere that like is anywhere close to the questions of like history or politics or beauty or meaning, right, that it starts to become hard to hold this kind of objective and precise and logical way of thinking. So in my mind, games, and especially video games, really bring these things together. And game design is about understanding how these two stances interrelate, understanding that they're not choices that you have to commit to, that they are temporary ways of framing your experience, and that there is a version of them that does kind of make sense of the world as they come together, right? So in games, we see both the kind of logical problem solving of the scientific frame, and this is why we talk about games in terms of like theory crafting, right? This is why people, you know what I mean? Like if in the Street Fighter community, there are people who don't even play. They're just scientists reverse engineering the software and like discovering new facts about it, right? But then of course, if you're a game designer, but I don't need to tell you that how much of your job is about like solving technical problems, understanding things in this mode of the engineer. But even as a player, you are still, as you work your way through Baldur's Gate, you are like making spreadsheets and like you're building a model in your head of how this little toy world works and how to solve problems in it and what are the facts about it, and discovering the overpowered builds that you want so much. But you're doing all of this within this larger context of a creative project. You're not actually doing it to break the world down into smaller pieces in order to master it, in order to go to Mars or something. You're doing it for its own sake. You're doing it as a creative act in order to experience it and enjoy it and perceive it and appreciate it. And so that's a sense in which I really think games and video games bring the two cultures together, or have a potential to do it. And my God, I'm just so ambitious, Charles. I want games to contribute to the world. I don't want them to be a thing we do after we're done with everything else, or instead of doing the things that are important. I want them to be done alongside the things that are important and to contribute to the things that are important. And if I told you that we could usher in a new Renaissance era in which science and art, kind of were things done hand in hand and not these oppositional modes that are like two teams that are competing for our attention, but that were something that like all of the power and purpose of science and engineering and all of the judgment and wisdom and sensibility of art, that is, in my mind, that's the ambition that we should have, right? As people who make games, care about games, play games, we should want them to do what they did in those great stories about the Renaissance, whether that actually happened or not. But like when we were like inventing perspective as a new way of seeing the world. And so I end the book with a nod towards AI. The book isn't primarily about AI, but I do think, as you can see, like this is like where we are at now in 2023. This is the thing that we're looking at. This is the thing that we're trying to wrap our heads around collectively. And I believe that games have this really, not just an opportunity to do it, but this is their job. Like this is what we were put here to do, to help understand what are computers, like what are they for? Why did we make them, and why do we want? Are we them? Do you know what I mean? Like, am I a really kind of evolved monkey, or am I just a program that was uploaded into the brain of a monkey? You know what I mean? Yeah. By evolution, and like, are we? I think I finally got it.
They're shutting you down, Frank.
Yeah.
You're too.
I got too close.
You got too.
I got too close to
the AI is like, cut him off. Cut him off.
Yeah.
So I think we have to answer that question. Frank is an AI that has been terminated by Sam Altman's Killbot. I think this is a real fire.
Sounds like.
I thought that was it. I thought we were all done for, but maybe we should do. Are we going to do?
Yeah, let's do questions. I think there's a microphone set up. Yep. Oh no.
Yeah.
There's one right there. Go.
All right, I'm good.
Hey.
Frank, this is Toby from Twitter.
Oh, hi, Toby.
Hey, great to meet you in person.
Great to meet you in person.
Okay, so maybe this kind of relates to where you're going to go with the AI question, but one thing I find kind of interesting about your thinking is you're also thinking not just about these instrumental design experiences, but I think the larger questions of like what humans are doing here. You're reading David Chapman. You're engaging like very deeply with the questions around AI and like the way they relativize some parts of human experience. And I guess I was wondering, I think you were going to get to this maybe, like what you think games can kind of say about those questions, and like also just how you, if you have perspectives on those things that don't belong to like the game ideas as well.
Sure. So assuming that we get to keep going. Okay. So Charles mentioned this idea of meta-rationality, which I think is a really important and interesting thing. And why is this important, and why do games have anything to do with it? Well, so rationale, like we're experiencing, like on a global civilizational scale, I think there is something like a crisis of meaning that is partly due to the vacuum left by religion, right? We're entering this kind of like post-religious phase of history, and religion was this thing that gave a structure and meaning to what we did, and that's missing, and now we kind of have to cobble it together. And I think it's really interesting to look at like the effective altruism movement, for example, which is embedded in this rationality kind of mode of like, look, let's figure out what matters with math. And we'll calculate what matters. We'll agree that this matters, and we'll do calculations, and then we'll pursue that using logic instead of just kind of thrashing around and doing what feels good. Let's do what actually is good. And then like a week later, so this was like a huge thing. And then a week later, you had Sam Bankman-Fried and you had like FTX, and the whole thing collapsed. And it's like, and I think there's something meaningful about that. I think there's something that really is important about the fact that that didn't work, right? That utilitarian frame of just like, let's apply logic and let's just do the thing that maximizes our expected value, and because it's more complicated than that. Like, it's not going to be that easy. Like, I think that's part of the answer. I actually think that you have to understand utilitarianism, and you have to be able to understand what's compelling about it and why people poured billions and billions of dollars into these stories about effective altruism and into these hedge funds and stuff. And then you have to understand, okay, why didn't it work?
Why don't those unbounded instrumental like reasoning things that aren't games, they're unbounded, why don't they work? There is a thing called the ludic fallacy. Nassim Taleb calls it the ludic fallacy. And as much, that guy's a jerk, as you know, but he's pretty smart. And the ludic fallacy is one of his good ideas, which is that anytime you use games as a metaphor to kind of like frame a real world situation, you're kind of fooling yourself, because no real world situation is ever as simple as an actual game. Because the real world is irreducible in a way that games are not. That's the point of games, to be reducible. The point of games is to have the simplest possible little toy universe and then discover that, wow, even in this totally simple thing, it's infinitely interesting. Like, it's infinitely like dense and cool and weird, and you can study it. But people, I think, want there to be a solution that has the cleanliness of a kind of game strategic, a game theoretical strategy, and utilitarianism is that fantasy. But meta-rationality is a way of being in the world that acknowledges the effectiveness and the power of rationality without falling victim to it as a universal, global, eternal frame. Whereas I think the people that the people who I think struggle with rationality as a lifestyle choice are kind of falling into that trap. And the reason games, I think, are useful in this context is because games are a thing that you dip into and then out of. So games, you move from world to world in games. I'm in Baldur's Gate, and then I'm in Hearthstone, and then I'm in tennis. And each one of these is an all-consuming thing that I could live inside of. But instead, I move between them. And that teaches us to have this flexible approach, which understands that no matter how good your system is, no matter how much it explains and how powerful it is, it's limited, it's temporary, it's finite.
Awesome. Next question.
Thanks. That was great conversation. And I was very struck that you quoted Barbarian Days, because when I read that book when it came out, I just reconfigured my life around to go surfing as much as possible,
Nice.
moved to California. And I remember that passage specifically. And it really struck me as a thing to put as a foil against games, or maybe as a similarity to games, because there is something kind of solipsistic, and he gets into this a lot in the book. He's kind of like down on surfing by the end of the book, not to ruin it or spoiler alert, but he's basically like, it's this thing that takes all this time. It's only for you. The more you do it, the less you enjoy it. And like, these things are true about surfing. It kind of sucks. It's like, like you have diminishing returns on the joy that you have with it. And when you were explaining it in the context of kind of like, why are games hard to write about? The answer to that question from a surfing perspective is that guy happened to be a New Yorker writer first, who was a good surfer, and then turned it into a Pulitzer book. And it was kind of a lucky incident that because any other surfing book is terrible. You can go read it. And, for the question. I'll make this real quick. I wonder if you ever had like a darker moment when trying to answer these questions about, well, maybe games are hard to write about because it's such a solitary thing, even though it can be very social. Cultural works are more social or more cultural.
Yeah. So let me store that, and then what should we do? Should we abandon ship? Or
They turned the lights off. The lights aren't even flashing. Let's just keep going.
all right, I'll keep going. And then when we smell smoke, we'll leave.
The curtains just. Once the curtains catch,
I mean,
we'll go home.
Look, this is the dilemma we all have to face as players of games. Like, what do we want from them? You know what I mean? Like, if you're like, and for that guy Finnegan, he made the round trip. You know what I mean? Because he was also, in addition to being a surfer, he was also a writer. And in addition to playing Baldur's Gate, you're also a student, a barista, a rock climber. You have all these other a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. Like, we have all of these different roles that we play, and things that we do, and ways of interacting with the world. And again, it is the fact that games are so absorbing. And, it's super famous. Like, there's this famous saying about chess. If you meet a promising young man and you want to kill him, don't use poison, don't use a knife, teach him to play chess, right? This is a famous old saying about it. And it's true. Chess kills people. Tennis kills people. Like, it's true. I don't want to belittle that. I don't want to like pretend that it's all sweetness and light. There are people whose lives are ruined by Hearthstone and or skiing or slot machines or gambling or any of these other things. That is a big question that each person has to answer for themselves. What I hope to do in the book is encourage people to kind of frame their own experiences in this way. Like, what am I doing and what do I want from it? And just to reflect on their own experience as a game maker or as a game player and say, what is this giving to me? What am I getting out of it? And how do I get more of the stuff I want? Yeah. Hi.
I want to go back to the thing you said earlier when you were starting to Charles asked you about the New York Times, or you mentioned the New York Times. And games are so awesome. There's a whole list of reasons why they're hard to write about. The first one is games are so awesome. You didn't actually finish the list. And I'm kind of interested in you steel manning, because you and I get into this all the time, steel manning the actual darker reasons that games got cut from the New York Times arts and entertainment section.
Yeah. Okay. Steel manning it in which sense? Like, which argument do you want me to advocate for?
You're being meta-rational right now.
Finish the list. I agree that games are awesome and are a cultural thing, but there's other reasons.
Well, it's partly because of this issue that video games are still kind of corny for the most part, right? They're still a little bit embarrassing for most people. Like, they still feel like they've got a lot of the trappings of kids culture. Or a lot of the trappings of adolescent male culture, as I said, that they're kind of boy toys. At a certain point in the 80s, it was decided that video games were going to be for boys, and it was as a marketing play. They were really emphasized that the sort of gendered aspects of it, and so in a sense, we have there's a lot of stuff in video games that still just is kind of mired in that, and then because it's our legacy, we also embrace it and we love it, and we kind of refer back to it as a historical antecedent. So we're not, we're like, no, we are, we're trying to find the grown-up meanings in the kinds of cute, kids culture stuff that happens in video games. So that's part of what's going on. But from an outside perspective, it's a lot of it is still like, oh, it looks like something you would paint on the side of a van. It's a barbarian princess in a leather bikini with a sword fighting a dragon, and I'm supposed to read this in the New York Times? I mean, come on! It's like, what's going on? And it's hard to explain to the editors of the New York Times. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't matter, right? But it does matter, but I don't want to overemphasize that, because I also think there's some sense in which, look, culture is just complicated, and maybe there's some arbitrary things that are happening that are leading. So I don't want to say that I have some really well worked out theory of why the mainstream journalism doesn't embrace games more. I think I'm partly as confused as anyone, but does that get at some of the things you were hoping to hear? No, you make games that the New York Times has to cover, right? You make things that they have to write about. Yeah, we have New York Times people here making games in the New York Times. That's one way of right? Jeff, you are part of the group of people that are making games in the New York Times. That's one way to do it. But also, if you're making video games, what do you think that just happens by magic? No, the reason that newspapers cover things is because people make them. They call them up and they say, come to my show. They call them up and they say, have you heard about my game? Like people bootstrap themselves into positions of being culturally important. There was the story of the young British artists, the last kind of great not avant-garde, but the last great fine arts movement, the YBAs, right? People like Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin and all those people. If you read the story of those guys, that's just them figuring out how to write press releases, how to trick people into coming to their shows. And then when the spotlight was on them, they rose to the challenge. They made work that people had to pay attention to. They lived up to, they demanded to be looked at and written about. And then they lived up to that moment and did work that was genuinely interesting and important. That's how you get your work written about in the New York Times. Don't wait around.
One more
question.
All right. I don't think this microphone is on. But
it's going to the screen.
It's good.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, it actually works.
So the last question dovetailed perfectly into mine, because there have been a lot of discussion about New York Times and whether certain fancy people have or have not written about games, and made me think about the MIT Press's first sentence in the paragraph describing your book, whether are games art?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if that question is in some way pandering to this literati audience, and whether that is a helpful audience to attempt to try to reach to.
Great question. Thank you. No, I appreciate that. I think you put your finger on an issue which I think is really subtle, and I try to negotiate well in this book, which is there's a way of looking at this, the problem that I'm trying to solve of getting games in conversation with, like a seat at the table where we talk about culture and what's important and blah, blah, blah. There's a way of looking at that as really just social ladder climbing, that I just want to elevate the status of games. I just want people to think of games as being cool and important and not dorky, and I want them to be thought of as intellectual, and and I tried to really resist that. I don't think that's the point I'm trying to make in the book. I think that that's a red herring. I think that that's if you go down that road, if you start to worry about status, well, why aren't we cool and glamorous? Our awards show is so dumb, Jeff Keighley, and it's not like the Oscars. It's no, we're never going to be like the Oscars. Do you know why? Because it's their job to be charismatic and to pretend to be in charge and to light up a room with their smile and to sing a song and tell a story and get everyone feeling good. And that's not what games are about. And we're never going to be that, right? And we shouldn't be trying to be that, because F that in a way. We've lived too long under the yoke of charismatic people with charming stories telling us how the world should be. right? Games are about exploring the world as it is. How do balls bounce? How does software work? You know, what are computers and what do they do? Like, what does this button do? Right? That's the question that games ask. We're never going to have the kind of status of certain of these other forms of culture that are about weaving the spell of charm over everything. Because we're slightly charmless, we're slightly gormless, but we should embrace that. We should not be trying to play the status game. As an industry, we're huge and important. People have to pay attention to us. Do the work that matters to you and make things that you're proud of and that your friends are proud of and that you want to play yourself. And get rich and famous doing it. That's my motto.
All right. Well, then, having a little danger of running over, then, what are you working on now?
Oh, I have a Substack. Subscribe to my Substack. That's basically, yeah. I'm writing on Substack. I'm doing game design. I'm still working with my wife Hillary and our son James on projects. As Everybody House Games, we're making games. We're trying to explore AI and and make cool, weird, interesting games like that. And yeah, just doing all kinds of different projects. But mostly subscribe to my Substack.
All right. Well, Frank, thank you so much for coming out here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.